if you look at the founding of this country and specifically how the Congress was set up, they set up a House of Representatives where theoretically each person would be equally represented. And in the Senate, each state would be equally represented. So 2 senators per state, irrespective of that state's population. And in the House, of course, each district is supposed to be equally represented. So it's not based there, it's based on the population of the state, whereas in the Senate, it's just if you're from the smallest state in the country, if you're from a state like Wyoming, which has actually fewer people than live in Washington, D.C., you have 2 senators. And if you live in California, you have 2 senators. And so those Americans in Wyoming have much more power in the Senate. And that's the way that the framers set the Senate up. It is true that there's been the story of the Senate would be the so-called cooling saucer that would cool the passions of the House. The Senate is already undemocratic in how it is set up, as I just said, by representing states equally. And for example, right now we have a 50-50 Senate where Senate Democrats actually represent 40 million more people than Senate Republicans, even though it's a 50-50 Senate, of course, with the vice president. But back to the framers for a moment. They did set up a system that makes it difficult to get legislation to the president's desk. It needs to pass the House, it needs to pass the Senate, it needs to be identical language, and then it goes to the president. And they considered, but rejected, a supermajority requirement for legislation. If you go back and look at Article 1 of the Constitution, it lays out when a supermajority is required in the Senate. It is required, for example, to override a presidential veto, to approve a treaty, to convict someone on impeachment. But passing legislation, that is not on the list. And if you go back and look at the Federalist Papers and the debate around the Constitution, you'll see, if you read Federalist 22 by Alexander Hamilton, he discussed at length what would happen if you required a supermajority to pass legislation. He said it would mean that the minority would rule and could be used to embarrass the administration and make it look weak and ineffectual, because the minority would govern and might not have an incentive to actually pass a bill and get it across the finish line. So the Constitution, the founders considered and rejected supermajority requirements. And if you go back to the nitty-gritty and the original rule books, scholars have looked at the rules of the early Senate and the early House of Representatives, and they were largely the same. Both of them, this is going to get a little in the weeds for a second, but both the House and the Senate provided for what was called the motion for the previous question, the PQ motion. That still exists in today's House of Representatives and in a lot of state legislatures. And that tool could end debate on a majority vote, a simple majority vote. That's what the motion for the previous question is. In about 1805, former Vice President Aaron Burr, the same Aaron Burr who led to Alexander Hamilton's demise in their duel, said, I think we can clean up the Senate rule book, and there's certain rules that we don't really need because we're a body of gentlemen. I'm paraphrasing here. And one of the rules that was scrapped was the previous question rule, the rule that could have been used to end debate by a majority vote. Fast forward a couple of decades, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina discovered that there was essentially a loophole, and that if you talked and talked and talked, you could eventually forestall any action and prevent a vote. And as you mentioned in the lead up to this, that's essentially where this came to be. It was primarily a tool of Southern segregationists who would use this loophole and failure of a way to end debate to essentially block civil rights legislation that would protect disenfranchised voters, Black and brown Americans. It was used to block anti-poll tax legislation, anti-lynching legislation, fair housing legislation. That's the history of this rule. But to your original question, it was considered and rejected by the framers because it would essentially be used in an undemocratic way to block the majority from even getting up or down votes on key pieces of legislation.